we were looking, Jory and I have been researching for a while, trying to build a keyboard that would be portable, something that you could bring with an iPad, and yet be a little bit more playable than the standard sort of mini keyboard that you can find on the market today. 2 and 3 octaves is pretty standard, but I found when I was playing these mini keyboards is that they kind of look like a piano keyboard when you hold them far away, but as your hand gets closer, you realize it really doesn't feel like, for anybody who plays the keyboard regularly, you find that this is a kind of a compromised shape. The arc of your hand that doesn't fit on the white keys, and it just feels cramped. You're really kind of struggling to play it. And looking at keyboards for a while, I noticed everybody that kind of shrunk a keyboard down to a portable size did the same thing. They just kind of made it look just like a regular piano keyboard and just made everything smaller. They scaled the whole thing down. So we were playing around with it, and it occurred to me that maybe the proportions don't necessarily have to be locked in. It makes something look like a keyboard, but maybe you could play around with the proportions a little bit and enhance the playability of a keyboard, even though it gets smaller. And doing some research on this, I was fascinated to find out that actually around the turn of the century, and indeed during like Mozart, Beethoven, all these guys were not necessarily composing on a 6.5-inch octave keyboard. So 6.5 inches is the standard piano octave that we're stuck with. That's from the edge of the C key to the edge of the B key above it. 6.5 inches from edge to edge. Somehow we're stuck with this keyboard, which really was only suitable for people like Chopin and Liszt, who were like 6'5" and had monster hands. So around the turn of the century, there were some small piano companies making what they called ladies' pianos that were adjusted. They just made the keyboard narrower, all the keys a lot narrower, down to as little as 4 3/4 inches, so substantially narrower than the current keyboard. And it made it a lot easier for most normal mortals to play. Your people who have trouble reaching an octave now would have no trouble on the ladies' keyboard. So these mini keyboards don't suffer that problem. They're all narrower in pitch. But I found that there just isn't enough sort of the white key in the front. It's just a little too small. And most piano players, you don't spend very much time at the top of the black keys. You really spend a lot of time down here on the white keys. So we played around with it and thought, if we can go ahead and make the thing narrower to fit the size of an iPad, because an iPad is really not very big, and getting 2 octaves in there is just probably pushing the limits of narrowness, but try and preserve the playability that you have of a piano keyboard by preserving as much of the white key length in front. I think we've hit upon maybe a good recipe for something that makes the keyboard a lot more playable in a very portable form factor. Another key thing about the keyboard is I think pianists really like when the key travels a good bit. So you want, as much as possible, the full key travel. And the big problem with full travel in a small keyboard is, well, it's got to be pretty thick. The typical piano key moves up and down about 1/2 inch at the tip. So getting something that looks nice and portable like this, you can see this isn't even 1/2 inch thick, so you're never going to get 1/2 inch of movement out of a key that fits in there. So faced with this dilemma, we're kind of scratched our heads thinking, well, what are the options? And immediately the idea, like, well, maybe the keys can pop up, and like maybe the black keys can pop up, or maybe both keys can pop up. Somehow can we get something that collapses into the space? And we kind of looked in the market and thought, well, surely somebody has solved this problem before. Like, we're not the first people who want a portable keyboard. It doesn't look like anybody has. There was we did find a cool little Japanese keyboard, a really, really tiny thing where the black keys themselves collapsed. But nothing that really addressed the travel issue on both keys, and nothing that got anywhere near piano key collapsibility. So we thought about it for a little while. This is kind of an early prototype. We started with where we also did the same thing. We maintained the ratio. These keys are actually almost the same length as a full piano key. A lot of the white key in front, but then I think we put too much of the black. There's too much black key. In the later design, we refined it and realized that we could probably shorten the black key without compromising playability too much. So this is where we are right now. And what we figured out what to do is, basically it's a complex series of 3 linked 4-bar linkages, if that makes sense. So it's basically 2 parallelograms front and back linked by a series of a trapezoidal parallelogram in here. It's really more complicated to say than actually it's pretty complicated, period. But if you look at the motion of this guy as he collapses, you can sort of see how the keys collapse into the space. And that linkage allows us, we can expand the keyboard up to, so that we have travel, and the thickness of the keyboard can be up to 3 times the thickness of the package that it comes in. So this 10mm box, 10mm thick box, from this 10mm thick box emerges this relatively thick, substantial keyboard. Now obviously the keys are themselves pretty thin, but the pianist really only touches the top surface. So, you know, some pianists spend a little bit of time touching the edge of the black key, but we think that compromise is a fairly modest one. Plus it kind of looks cool to see through the keys, I think, you know, seeing how the thing works underneath. But really it's just sort of a beautiful motion, having that whole thing collapse into very little space. But at the end, once it's up, you have something which really moves and feels like a piano. You can play chords. You know, now with I don't have very large hands, and octaves are trivial. Now I can actually do a tenth, or even well, tenth are easy, but even the Holy Grail, which is the octave and a fifth. You can do some interesting things, and I think I don't think anybody's ever experienced a keyboard where the keys are still fairly spacious front to back. So you can really get the full arc of your hand on it. Just the way that every piano teacher tells you, you know, hold like you're holding a golf ball or a tennis ball in your hand, have that nice arc. You have to have enough white key in front for that to work. And I think we sort of struck a good balance there. Certainly I think it's territory worth exploring more, but really this keyboard feels great. Now, coupled with making a keyboard that goes through this motion is a lot of complexity involved in how you detect where the key is, how fast it's going down, because most MIDI controllers really want to know at the very least how fast the key is moving, velocity sensitivity. And for that, the way it's typically done, you usually have 2 switches which close in sequence, one shortly after the other, and you're just scanning around, and you just sort of time the delay between those 2 switch closures, and that tells you how fast the key is moving. We looked at trying to do that. It's actually really complicated when everything moves. So this whole bit is moving through complex motions. There's the black keys move through a 70-degree arc. The white keys move through a full 90-degree arc. There's a whole chunk in the middle here that has to move with it. So in looking to find solutions to that problem, we looked at alternatives. So we looked at certainly Hall effect sensors and optical detectors. And the beauty of those latter 2 is that they don't require any physical contact between the actuator, the key itself, and the detector itself. You can actually, they can be, first of all, they can change an angle, and they don't really care. So if you get the geometry right, you can play around with that. But not having physical contact, not requiring a plunger to be pushed and a switch to be closed, simplifies the design a little bit. Ironically, it causes headaches for the electrical engineers, but that's why we have, you know, brilliant electrical engineers to solve those problems for us. And the other problem is how you get a spring action. We ripped apart a couple of keyboards that have the Holy Grail is weighted wood action keys, or weighted action keyboards. And I would have loved to figure out a way to get sort of anti-gravity little keys in this space, but it's such a small package. Quickly we realized that you can't sort of do the inverted steel hammer approach that is used on some of those keyboards. So we wanted something that would still feel a little bit better. This is a very nice keyboard. It's pretty well done. As many keyboards go, it's pretty good, but its spring action really is done entirely by collapsing a rubber dome and then bending the plastic itself. So the plastic itself, the key itself, is basically just a bent piece of plastic, and that is the spring. And you can sort of feel that when you push those things down. Like it gets a little stiffer as it goes down. There's a certain sort of rigidity that you don't get with a piano key. A piano key is really just a lever floating in space, and it's got a little weight at one end, and when you push it, the only resistance you really feel is the inertia of the key itself, and there's a organicness to that motion that that pianists get used to, because all you have to really do is get the key moving, and then its own inertia kind of propels it down further. There's some hammer, some other actions moving in there, which creates some other subtleties and secondary touches. But so we're trying to figure out is there a way to get some of that feel, approximate that feel through other means. We started with this guy, which had a traditional leaf spring just a bent piece of steel and an arch. It was the only thing we could think of that would collapse flat, and then when you expanded it, the spring would wind up and create a little bit of tension for the keys. Of course, multiplied by 24, all those springs create a lot of tension that you have to wind up to give you the tension. So it was a challenge to deploy this. We had a couple interesting mechanisms to pull the keyboards into position. But exploring it further, Jory had the idea of, well, it started sort of almost as a joke, like, well, what about magnetic repulsion? That just the two opposing magnets, two north-facing magnets. They create lots of repulsion forces. There's no physical contact between the two elements, and yet you get a lot of force between those two things. And after sort of dismissing it for a little while, we looked a little bit more seriously at it, and it turns out it's a very compelling solution to this particular problem, particularly to this unique problem of having the geometry of all the different pieces and linkages inside change dramatically throughout from the two positions. So the posts, if you will, that have to support the spring action of this key, they have to be vertical and they've got to stand up here, but then they have to all lie down and disappear into nothing. They all have to fit inside of 10mm enclosure. So the only way that was going to work is if that whole thing, which is fairly tall, up to 30mm, rotates down 90 degrees and lies flat. And magnets, because they don't require any physical contact between the keys themselves, the magnets in the key and the magnets in the posts, were kind of a good solution to that problem. They introduce plenty of their own little complexities, but they really create a simpler mechanism. And another wonderful side effect is that you can play around with the spring tension. You can get a nice feel with the magnetic repulsion is different from a steel spring or any kind of passive spring. You can play around with it and get a really kind of smooth feel. It's not weighted action, but it's an improvement, we think, over the standard friction or linear spring, bar spring, in this case living hinge spring. And there's the potential to even have adjustability with a magnet just by changing the spacing between the magnets. We can change the tension between the black and the white keys very easily. There's lots of tuning potential, but mostly it just creates a great feel. Like you really play around with this and it just feels nice. For something that's so small and so light, you get a little bit of resistance, but you don't get the sense that you're bending something. You get the sense more that something's moving. It's getting closer to the feel of an inertial motion. So we have this, we think, a pretty compelling idea, a very small package with some reasonable complexity, but buys you a very, very portable keyboard. So here we have two of our prototypes using clear keys. We love clear keys because we think they look really cool, but they actually serve a pretty useful debugging purpose for a mechanical engineer and potentially also an electrical engineer. You can see through the whole key and see the mechanism inside. So as you roll this thing through its motions, and we can watch anything that might hit. We can see the electrical components change in their orientation relative to the pieces they're supposed to be detecting. It's very handy, but for this purpose, it really just kind of looks cool. And I wanted to focus a little bit of attention on why we chose 24 keys instead of 25. So there's a couple reasons. Most 2-octave keyboards on the market would typically add the top C key. So you have 2 octaves plus a C key at the very top. So you get sort of a unified look, especially if you're in C major, you get that last octave, your pinky's on a key. There's a couple reasons why we decided to not do that. First of all, we're already fairly narrow in the iPad form factor. So by dropping one key, we increased the width of all the keys a little bit so that we're a little bit more playable. We didn't want to get them any narrower really than this. But the big advantage, I think, is that our keyboard, because it's fairly thin and low profile and the keys are already fairly close to the edge, has the option of being joined to another of its mates. And we'll have little clips for this purpose. As many as you want, really, but you can imagine here we have now a 4-octave keyboard because B from the one keyboard lines up with C of the next keyboard. And if you're a pianist at all, you'll appreciate having this extra real estate to get 2 hands on the keyboard. The possibility of having a 6-octave keyboard in something the size of 3 iPads, I think is pretty compelling for anybody who's ever traveled with a keyboard. Most portable or road keyboards will be are even less. They're actually only 5 octaves, and yet they'll be quite a bit longer. That still takes up most of this table. So we think that the ability to just carry 2 or 3 to get 4 or 6 octaves in a package which is really just, this times, three slabs of that thing is very, very small, very portable form factor. I think it's really, really compelling. Again, we looked on the market to see what was out there, assuming that some frustrated pianist somewhere must have at some point commissioned somebody to make a keyboard that was a little bit more portable. And there are a couple products out there, but they mostly go about the problem by just taking a standard electronic keyboard, sort of sawing it in half, putting a hinge there, flipping it upside down. And yes, that does get you into a suitcase that will go on to checked baggage. And I'm sure it's a very nice keyboard, but it didn't really feel to us like something that, even approaches this in portability. Something that's just something you don't even think about, you just stuff in your briefcase. Having a 6-octave keyboard potentially that you can just throw into a briefcase with your iPad, or multiple iPads if you want to have lots of extra screen real estate, I think is very compelling. So the ability to join keyboards, I think, is highly valuable.